right, back on the record in the Simpson matter. Mr. Simpson is again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Shapiro, Mr. Cochran, Mr. Douglas, Mr. Bailey, Mr. Blasier, people represented by Ms. Clark, and Mr. Kelberg. Jury is not present. Counsel, anything we need to take up before we take up the next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. I am down here not as a result of anyone else's efforts, but of my own accord, because I couldn't help on Friday but review the court's ruling with respect to Mr. McDonald's testimony, and then to review Dr. Rieders' report, my understanding being that Dr. Rieders will be the next witness called by the defense. And it struck me as ironic, if nothing else, that in the court's ruling regarding Mr. McDonald, the court on page 2 of its ruling noted near the end, just before the section dealing with discovery violations, the previous evidence code section 352 objection by the defense to phenolphthalein-based presumptive test for human blood is still well taken for all the reasons previously advanced. And what struck me from that in the court's order is Dr. Rieders' report concerning his analysis of the test results of Mr. Martz from the FBI, because on page 2 in the concluding paragraph of Dr. Rieders' report, he says, thus the finding of EDTA in a micro blood specimen such as in the present ones is consistent with, indicative of, and presumptive for the blood having originated from a specimen which has been placed into a usually lavender top blood collection and then handwritten in as EDTA tube, such as is commonly used to draw blood from a living person and keep it from coagulating. What I believe the evidence would show, Your Honor, with respect to the analysis by Dr. Rieders is there can be among the 11 million organic compounds known in the universe, hundreds perhaps, that would give a reading, a pattern, to use a shorthand version, of findings consistent with what Dr. Rieders in his report is only willing to say is a pattern which is consistent with, indicative of, and presumptive for EDTA. It seems to me that for all the reasons expressed by the defense to keep out phenolphthalein testing, because it's misleading, confusing to the jury of the real issues and so forth, the same applies with respect to Dr. Rieders' testimony, proposed testimony, with respect to the EDTA testing of the two blood stains. This is not evidence that in fact shows there is EDTA, according to Dr. Rieders' own report. It only reflects that the result is presumptive of EDTA, and we can go into the technicalities, but basically the full spectrum that you need to see in order to say I identify EDTA is absent, that it is not a full spectrum, and only what is present can be used to say, in the opinion of Dr. Rieders, it is indicative of, consistent with, presumptive for. What's good for the goose, Your Honor, I submit, is good for the gander. Now, why is this important? Because if there is only one other compound in the universe which, besides EDTA, could give the pattern which is the pattern found in the stains from the gate and the socks, and from, I'll get into that, Ms. Clark, in just a moment. If there's only one other compound that could give that pattern, then the evidence may have far more probative value than if hundreds of other compounds could provide that result. But we don't know which hundreds could provide it, because, as the evidence would show, Dr. Rieders, number one, has never done this test for EDTA using this equipment. His laboratory does not have this equipment. And the laboratory that he has to go to when he wants to use this kind of equipment does not have electrospray, which is, in fact, the process used by the FBI. But it's the FBI's report and analysis which Dr. Rieders is going to come in here and talk about, supposedly. Now, I find it most curious that a man who's never done this testing for EDTA using this equipment, who doesn't have the equipment in his laboratory, and who has to go to a lab to do this kind of laboratory test but can't do it on that equipment because it's not specifically the same kind, is going to come in here and start talking about, is this EDTA or is this not EDTA? And what's important is all he's going to say, by his own admission, in his own report, is it's presumptive of. Let me give the court a further understanding of why I think it is so potentially misleading. And it is an example from Dr. Rieders' past, recent past. A very well-known case in the Southern California area, the Sconce, S-C-O-N-C-E case, oleander poisoning. The history, Your Honor. A gentleman was found dead in 1985, death attributed to cardiac arrest. A young man, a very overweight man, and a man in the funeral business, a competitor of Mr. Sconce's. There was an informant who in about 1990 suggested that Mr. Sconce, or that the victim, had been poisoned by oleander poisoning. As a result of which, the Ventura County District Attorney's Office retained the services of Dr. Rieders to perform an analysis of various substances preserved from autopsy to determine the presence of something called oleandrin, which is part and parcel of the oleander plant and is a toxin. Let me read the court just very briefly Dr. Rieders' testimony at the preliminary hearing in 1990, October 4th, regarding his findings. In this case, 3 independent tests were done: thin layer chromatography, fluorescent spectrophotometry, and radioimmunoassay. These are physiochemically different things. The chances that a substance has all the properties in all 3 tests in common and is in actuality another substance, and his opinion was that these tests showed it was oleandrin, from experience are so extremely remote that one then has a very high degree of scientific certainty that if one says that this is oleandrin, in fact it is. 100% never. For 100% you go to the seminary, because that depends on faith. Science is never 100%. It is statistical, and it is reasonably certain the chances are remote. And if you want to go over into the area of, in that area, the hand of Almighty God can make anything happen, so possibilities, of course, are there. But it's a high degree of reasonable scientific certainty, and the operative word is reasonable. A scientist goes by reason and not by feeling. Well, the defense attorney for Mr. Sconce didn't think going by feeling was a very good way to go either. So he proposed having additional and more sophisticated tests performed, and guess what? The prosecution, which included Mr. Giss of our office as a specially designated prosecutor for Ventura County, agreed to split the $20,000 bill to have the sophisticated testing done using LC-MS equipment at Cornell University, incidentally, where Mr. McDonald, I believe, makes his headquarters, Cornell, New York, and that the testing was to be done to determine the presence or absence of oleandrin and another metabolite product. And guess what? Wasn't there. The testing by Dr. Henyon demonstrated that what Dr. Rieders was willing to say to reasonable scientific certainty, not to 100% because he's not God, it wasn't there. And guess what happened? A man charged with a potential capital offense saw his case dismissed as a result of Dr. Henyon's findings. And guess what further happened, Your Honor? Because I'm sure the court understands that before the prosecutor is going to dismiss a potential capital murder offense based upon an expert's finding, he's going to want to go back to the original expert, Dr. Rieders, and say, explain, please, where is Dr. Henyon wrong? Tell us. Dr. Rieders, I talked to Mr. Giss in Ms. Clark's office on Friday, basically gave a rambling, non-responsive answer, but a newspaper account of the story is succinct and to the point. From the April 4th, 1991 Los Angeles Times, Henyon reported last week that he had found no signs of oleandrin, but he said he was still looking for substances created when oleandrin breaks down in the body. After trial recessed Wednesday, Henyon telephoned with his results. No evidence of poison. Rieders, reached at his home near Philadelphia, said he could not account for the difference between his finding and Henyon's. Quote, in science, unquote, Rieders said, quote, nothing is unquestionable, unquote. Now, Your Honor, I submit that this is exactly why presumptive test results should not be given to this jury under 352, because they are so misleading. They are not probative. Dr. Rieders cannot say what other compounds could produce the findings that the lab reports from Mr. Martz indicate. And to allow Dr. Rieders to give presumptive testing when the court sustained defense objections to presumptive testing is not to be fair to both sides in this case, using basically the same rule of law applied to the same general aspect of the case. Now, as the court will recall, when I was last here arguing the admissibility of Mr. Simpson's statement on the exercise video, I argued something on the assumption the court may not accept my position that the statement was admissible. That is, I wanted the tape played to show the physical movement. I make the same statement now that I made then, Your Honor, that I believe this motion should be granted. But I also feel it incumbent on myself to raise additional points in the event the court feels that the motion is not well taken. Number one, the oleandrin incident is a clear mistake by Dr. Rieders, which, using the rationale of the defense with respect to Dr. Golden, and of course that's really why I'm down here, because I have some familiarity with the evidentiary issues on this issue, where the issue is the competency of the expert witness, the court found that these specific examples of mistakes become admissible. And here, unlike Dr. Golden with gunshot wounds versus knife wounds, here we have the very same process taking place. Are we looking at something which is indicative of, consistent with, and presumptive for the chemical, or are we identifying the chemical in the substance? Big difference. And that's exactly what is at issue here, because I believe, I submit to the court, the evidence will show that in fact this is not EDTA. Agent Martz's unpreserved blood gave the same result as was found on the stains from the glove and from the gate. Not a quantitative result, but showing the same pattern, unpreserved. And that's a pretty interesting finding with respect to whether we carry EDTA in our systems, if it's EDTA, or whether there are some other compounds that give the same pattern. So number one, the issue of does he get cross-examined if he testifies about his mistake? I submit to the court, using parity of reason, he gets cross-examined. Number two, and I mentioned this to Ms. Clark, is really why I thought it important that I come down and argue this point, because the court will recall in cross-examining Dr. Golden, Mr. Shapiro wanted to cross-examine Dr. Lakshmanan, wanted to cross-examine Dr. Lakshmanan regarding the legal implications from the mistakes in the Gay Phillips case, which Dr. Golden acknowledged making. I think the court will recall that area of proposed cross-examination. And I objected to it on, among other grounds, that it's irrelevant. And that was because the issue for the mistake went to the competency of Dr. Golden. But I submit to the court that it is proper cross-examination of Dr. Rieders to show the legal implications from his failure and refusal to acknowledge that he was wrong. Because now we're not talking about his competency, we are talking about his bias. Dr. Rieders put his professional standing, his ability to get future business, his ability to retain his position as director of a laboratory above the liberty rights of Mr. Sconce, rather than acknowledge that Dr. Henyon's more sophisticated test proved that in fact there was no oleandrin poisoning. He takes the position in science, nothing is unquestionable. Goes to bias, the legal ramifications. So I submit to the court that if Dr. Rieders gets to testify, he gets cross-examined not only about the mistake, but he gets cross-examined regarding his response to that mistake and the legal implications from his failure or refusal to acknowledge it as a mistake. because he needed to place his selfish interests above those of Mr. Sconce, the criminally charged defendant. So again, Your Honor, I raise these 2 points not because I believe our motion to preclude his testimony in its entirety is not well taken. I raise these points because I don't know how the court's going to rule, and I want to give the court the full picture of what I believe are issues related to Dr. Rieders' proposed testimony.
All right. Thank you, counsel.
May I have just one moment, Your Honor? Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Blasier.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, counsel.
Let me talk about the second issue first. I think it's just absolutely outrageous that Mr. Kelberg would come in and read from a newspaper and argue that there's been some determination that Dr. Rieders made a mistake in the Sconce case. If we want to litigate the Sconce case, we can, but it's going to take us about a month. The testing that was done by Mr. Henyon was done on a 5-year-old autopsy, a different autopsy, different tissue than the testing done by Dr. Rieders earlier. Dr. Henyon, in his reports, my understanding, acknowledges that perhaps what Dr. Rieders saw might have been there when he saw it, but because the second autopsy 5 years later might not show the same thing. The case was dismissed. There were other reasons for its dismissal. We can litigate that from here to Sunday, and it's absolutely ludicrous to say that they should be able to cross-examine him on that kind of a case where there's been no legal determination that any mistake was made. In fact, no mistake was made. These are contrary opinions on scientific evidence, which happens all the time. And the notion that Mr. Kelberg would come in and raise his voice because a scientist would say he's not certain about something is outrageous. No scientist is going to get up there and tell you he's absolutely positive about anything if he's a real scientist. So I make a motion that they not be allowed to cross-examine on that issue at all, on 352 grounds certainly, and a lack of showing that there's any legal basis to cross-examine. As to the first issue, on whether this is a presumptive test or not, first of all, Mr. Kelberg has not read Dr. Rieders' report carefully. His report states that the testing done by the FBI does show the presence of EDTA in the blood stain from the sock and from the gate. There's no language about presumptive for in that part of his report. The second part of the report, where he tries to attribute a source as to where this could have come from, is where he uses the term presumptive, not in the sense of a phenolphthalein test, where with a phenolphthalein test we know that there are a lot of common occurring substances that can give the same response as blood, and therefore it's only a test that narrows it down somewhat. Could have been something else, so they have to do follow-up tests to confirm it. These are not presumptive tests. I find it fascinating that Mr. Kelberg would use Mr. Henyon's LC-MS-MS testing to prove that Dr. Rieders made a mistake when he's claiming now that LC-MS-MS is just a presumptive test. That's the same testing that was done in this case. They might say that there are hundreds of compounds that could give this pattern. They can't name a single one. I asked Agent Martz, he can't name a single one. They have not looked at all 11 million organic compounds. There may be 11 billion in the universe. We don't know. So you can't absolutely say that there isn't something else out there that we've never seen before that might give this same pattern. That doesn't make it a presumptive test. I'm assuming that the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office has been prosecuting people for years based on LC-MS tests or GC-MS tests, which has less information than the tests run by the FBI in this case. Those tests have been used since the 70s to demonstrate that you have a particular substance in your blood, for instance. They're not presumptive tests. There's no case that says they're a presumptive test. They are determinative tests. They can make arguments that maybe there's some other compound out there somewhere, the name of which we do not know, that might give the same result, and Agent Martz will say that, and Dr. Rieders will say that as well. But they will also say that the only compound they know of that gives everything that we see here, namely the right retention time, the right parent ion, the right daughter ion, and the right other characteristics that you must have before something can even be tested, is EDTA. And Dr. Rieders will say, in his opinion, this is EDTA because it meets every one of those characteristics. As to the electrospray issue, electrospray is a process by which you move from the chromatography stage to the mass spec stage. With liquid chromatography, you're working with a liquid that has to be converted to a gas before you can do the mass spec part of it. All electrospray does is changes the liquid to the gas. It doesn't change the ions, it doesn't change the compound, it doesn't change the measurement system. You still wind up with chromatograms that you look at and you analyze. saying that this should be determinative of whether an expert testifies is like saying that Julia Child can't tell you anything about cooking because she doesn't use a Cuisinart. It's one technique that's used as one step in the process. It's not, it doesn't change anything. You wind up with a chromatogram that's interpreted just like they all are. So I would submit that this is clearly not a presumptive test, and further that the prosecution should not be allowed to cross-examine on the sconce case or any other case that they may not have mentioned unless they present it beforehand so that we can litigate that as well.
May I briefly respond?
Briefly.
Number one, just for consistency, it's Dr. Henyon. It's not Mr. Henyon. Number two, it is a more sophisticated test than any of the tests that Dr. Rieders used. Number three, the evidence is clear. Dr. Rieders, in fact, we have his article, A Quest for Oleandrin in Decayed Human Tissue, noted. His findings showed it wasn't there. And he doesn't make any reference whatsoever to Dr. Rieders having been possibly correct in the past with respect to his analysis. If that were the case, this case might still have been prosecuted. We are not inclined to lightly dismiss capital murder cases, Your Honor. That is dismissed because of the overpowering and overwhelming and compelling nature of Dr. Henyon's results. Last thing is, who's the proponent of this evidence? The people at the left side of the council table, to my left. It's their responsibility to show no other compound. It's not our responsibility to say, oh, gee, you know, there's only one or two others or maybe a couple hundred. It's their responsibility. When they're talking about it's presumptive of, and that's really what the conclusion is. The issue for this jury is, hey, where does this stuff come from? If it's EDTA, where does it come from? And that's this issue that the jury is being asked to decide when, in fact, the expert, the best he's going to say is it's presumptive for. If he's using the language, I didn't put words in his mouth, I didn't put the words in this report, he wrote them. He should have to live by them. I submit for all the reasons previously expressed, Your Honor, he should be precluded from testifying. But if the court feels differently than I on this, that the two areas of inquiry that I've indicated are appropriate. Dr. Henyon's, I asked Mr. Hodgman to make sure he's available to clear the air should there be any air need clearing regarding what the test results were. And I have every expectation that he would be available.
All right. For the purposes of the record, Mr. Blasier, do we have Dr. Rieders' report marked as an exhibit at this point?
I don't think we do. We provided it to the court last week.
I think we should have, I think for the purposes of the appellate record, I think we need to have a copy here.
I'll submit my copy, Your Honor.
All right. All right, the 352 objection as to Dr. Rieders' testimony regarding his testing for the presence of EDTA, the objection is overruled. I will allow his testimony. The cross-examination as to other testing and other cases done by Dr. Rieders appears to be a fair game for cross-examination. Legal ramifications, however, of scientific testing appears to the court to be a 352 problem because there are many explanations as to why things are done legally. It's a apples and oranges argument, so the objection by the defense as to legal ramifications is sustained. All right, and for the purposes of the record, we'll mark a copy of Dr. Rieders' report as Court's Exhibit 18. All right, Deputy McNair, let's have the jurors, please. be seated. All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All right, the defense may call their next witness.
Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Fredric Rieders.
All right.
Can you please raise your right hand? You do solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please have a seat in the witness stand and state and spell your first and last names for the record.
Good morning, Doctor. Could you state and spell your name, sir?
My name is Fredric, F-R-E-D-R-I-C, Rieders, R-I-E-D-E-R-S.
Mr. Blasier.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Dr. Rieders, where and when were you born?
I was born in 1922 in Vienna, Austria.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a forensic toxicologist and director of a toxicology laboratory.
Could you tell us what toxicology is?
Toxicology is the study of chemical substances and of primarily biological systems in terms of focusing on the harmful effects that the chemicals can produce in the biological system. Simplified version, toxicology is the study of poisoning, and I deliberately say poisoning in quotes rather than poison because everything's a poison in too large a quantity. The definition of a poison is that it's too much.
Doctor, could you please tell us about your educational background? Excuse me. Doctor, would you pull the microphone down, please? There you go. Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Blasier.
I studied, my undergraduate studies were at New York University's Washington Square College, at Columbia University, at the University of Indiana in Bloomington, at Houston University, and a little bit on courses while I was in service overseas by correspondence from the University of Wisconsin. I received a Bachelor's of Arts degree from New York University's Washington Square College in New York in 1948. My major subject was chemistry. My minor subject was biology. I then went on to a Master of Science degree in chemistry, in which I specialized in toxicological analysis chemistry, in the analysis that is used at that time essentially in autopsy specimens. After I received a master's degree and became eligible to be a doctoral candidate at New York University, I was offered a special fellowship at the Jefferson Medical College of Philadelphia, which is part of Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, in their School of Graduate Studies, not towards an MD degree, but towards a doctoral PhD degree. And there, during the following, 2 years of work and 1 year of this, that, and the other thing, I received the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, again, not medicine, a PhD degree. My major subject was pharmacology, toxicology, pharmacology being the study of the effects of chemical substances from no effect to through toxicology to a lethal effect, as well as what the body does to the chemicals as it is in toxicology. And my minor subjects were pathology, the study of disease, and physiology, the study of the function of organisms, essentially the functions of the human organism of man. That was my formal education. Of course, I did research and presented a thesis on the toxicology of a substance called acrylonitrile, and I was granted the degree in 1952.
Can you spell acrylonitrile for the court?
acrylonitrile
Could you describe your other academic experience and affiliations?
Yes. While I was a graduate student at Jefferson, I was also a graduate assistant, and I did laboratory demonstrations in toxicology for the medical students. I did work for the clinic because I had some techniques from my previous work experience in lead determination in blood and other toxicological analyses, which were very rare at the time. Not many people had them, so I assisted in this sort of thing. I also participated in other research besides my own doctoral research. After I received a degree, I was appointed an instructor in the Department of Pharmacology and in industrial medicine as an assistant instructor. And I taught medical students, second-year medical students, toxicology, both in the laboratory and at lecture. I worked with other graduate students, and I conducted research in various areas of pharmacology and toxicology. And I lectured, of course, as I mentioned. This went on until 1956, at which time I had been promoted to assistant professor and had done research in pharmacology, toxicology, industrial medicine, and that incidentally included a lot of research with EDTA at the time, which had just come into use for the treatment of certain types of metal poisonings. In 1956, the city of Philadelphia changed from a coroner system to a medical examiner system. And the first medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Spellman, asked me to apply for the position of chief toxicologist upon the recommendation of my former chief, Dr. Alexander Gettler, who is sort of a granddaddy of American toxicologists, whom I had worked for at Bellevue. So I became an instructor, and then I left the employ of the city. I took an examination with several other people. I scored appropriately and was selected for the position of chief toxicologist for the city of Philadelphia and director of its, well, at that time, and starting a poison information center and directing it.
Let me back up just a minute before we get into your employment history, if we could. Have you told us about all of your teaching experience or academic experience with respect to professorships?
Well, only up until then. I remained on the faculty at Jefferson. I still am. I'm a full professor now. I became an associate professor and a full professor in the course of time. On a part-time basis, of course, and when the money crunch came, I agreed to forego my salary, which was minimal. It was a stipend, but I donated it to Jefferson, and I'm still on the faculty pro bono, which means I don't get paid for it. Now, for the last few years, I have not lectured to medical students, but I have worked with graduate students, continue to work with graduate students, and I'm starting a whole new course where I will start lecturing in the fall or in the spring.
Now, before we get into your employment history, could you tell us whether you have any affiliations with professional associations?
Yes. The first professional association which I joined was the American Chemical Society, of which I'm still a full member, as well as of several of its divisions, including the Division on Analytical Chemistry. Then later on, I joined several other societies that were particularly involved in pharmacology, American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. I'm a full member of that. Some local societies, which since I no longer stayed active, I dropped from. But I became a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. I'm now a fellow, in particular of the section on toxicology, on forensic toxicology, of which I was one of the chairmen for one of the sessions some years ago, and had various other official capacities in the academy since about 1958 or 59, since I've been a member there. I'm a member of, and I'm one of the founders, one of the charter members of the International Association of Forensic Toxicologists, which was formed, I think it was around 1960, at a meeting in England. I was the first editor of its bulletin, which is after finally somebody with a printing press made himself available. I ran on a Xerox machine for a couple of years. I'm a member of of several other organizations. I am a member of the American Association of Forensic Toxicologists, which is called Society of Forensic Toxicology, which is somewhat similarly composed and somewhat similar to the activities of the toxicology section of the Academy of Forensic Sciences. And I got certified by the American Board on Forensic Toxicology, which is part of the Academy, as a fellow, as a board-certified forensic toxicologist. I'm also a member of the American Association of Clinical Chemists. Those are the chemists who work in hospitals and in other places, mainly to help in the diagnosis of disease. There is a section, an area in it, a specialty of toxicology, of toxicological chemistry. And I am board certified in toxicological chemistry by the American Association of Clinical Chemists. I'm a member of an international association on risk analysis and several others, but these are my main professional background organizations.
Now, could you tell us a little bit about, briefly about your employment history prior to the time that you started your own lab?
Well, I want to tell you all the different jobs I had when I came here as an immigrant, which was from steve door to glass blower to anything you could do in 1939. But my first related position developed in 1941 when I became an assistant chemist, of all things, in a soda factory, in preparing flavors and doing preparatory analyses. After that, I worked for another chemical company that made detergents and a variety of other things as an assistant chemist, and then I went into the service. I was in the military during World War II as a surgical technician, and then as a interpreter because of my various language skills. That was towards the interpreter was at the end, towards the end of the war, and then for a year or so afterwards in military government. When I returned to the States, I continued under the GI Bill with my college education, but after 1 year, all I had left were some rather easy courses, so I sought employment, and I received a job through the Employment Service as a junior toxicologist, a trainee in toxicology, in the office of the Chief Medical Examiner of the City of New York, and under the chief toxicologist, Dr. Alexander Gettler and Dr. Charles Umberger. I was there for approximately two and a half years, being trained there and actually performing service work, of course. I then, as I mentioned, went to Jefferson, and I took you through the time that I left my full-time status as at that time, assistant professor, and became chief toxicologist for the city of Philadelphia. My job at that point in time was to organize a laboratory and a division of toxicology. There was none in the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner had just been established, and also to organize and direct the Poison Information Center for the city. After that, what I did is the medical examiner's office was in the health department of the city. I conducted toxicological analyses on autopsy cases for the medical examiner, assisted hospitals in the differential diagnosis of poisoning. At that time, that's about the only source they had for laboratory work, is to avail themselves of the medical examiner's toxicologist. I did some consultative work for a variety of city agencies, and I started to train and conduct research in toxicology as well. I did that from 1956 when I became chief, and I I organized and directed the Poison Information Center. I did that until 1970 for 14 years, and
Is Office of the Medical Examiner, is that similar to what we call a coroner?
very similar, yes. The operation that was here, the toxicologist that was here was a colleague of mine that I knew very well for many years, and the the coroner I knew very well, and I still know all the people quite well in the ME's office here. It's very similar. You have I think you have a coroner's medical examiner or a coroner's chief forensic pathologist. So it adds up to the same thing. It's just a politically different issue. The medical examiner is appointed upon examination and selection.
This is not your employment history. Ask another question, please.
Can you tell us from 1956 to 1970, when you were with the medical examiner's office, approximately how much of your work involved working with law enforcement agencies?
Well, it all related to law enforcement agencies. We had a weekly conference with the chief of the DA's homicide division, with the chief homicide detective in the city of Philadelphia, going over all the homicide cases. But the office was independent of the law enforcement agencies as a very important part of its function, and that is to be an ombudsman in cases for the medical examiner, not the toxicologist, to determine the manner of death, whether or not criminality might be involved.
Now, from 1970 to now, what's your employment been?
Well, in 1970, I left the employment of the city and started an independent laboratory and consultative company, National Medical Services, in which at that time I continued to do a lot of post-mortem toxicology for the surrounding counties.
I'll get into the specifics of that, but how large is National Medical Services now?
Well, now it has 120 people in it. It's not my doing, that's my son's.
And does that company do business with law enforcement agencies?
Yes, indeed.
Approximately what percentage of the work is done for law enforcement agencies?
The forensic work that we do is perhaps as much as 20% of our work.
Could you give me just a real rough list of some of the law enforcement agencies that you work for?
Well, we work for many of the police departments in the surrounding counties, for the district attorney's office, for cases that they bring to us in the surrounding counties. We occasionally work with the police department and the courts in the city of Philadelphia, too. We are outside the city. So we assist there on, well, either the courts themselves or sometimes the defense attorneys. It makes no difference.
Do you work with...
We also do work for police departments at times in New Jersey, as far away. Well, we have done work for the Los Angeles Police Department at one point, or we may have done some more recently that I don't know of. So we do it for all over the country.
Do you do work for any foreign police agencies?
Yes, occasionally we did some work for the medical examiner and the prosecutor in Brazil, in one of the countries. Puerto Rico, of course, was part of the United States. We have done work there. We've received specimens in 3 criminal cases, potential criminal cases, from Australia. One of which is specifically from a police department, the other one's from a medical examiner, third one a private party, recently.
Does your lab do work for other labs?
It's a major part of our work is reference work. That means work that large laboratories which do a lot of clinical analysis get, and that are specialized toxicological tests, and they send them to us via their reference lab.
Can you give us an estimate of how much of your business is actually work that other labs send to you to do for them?
I can only give it to you for the time while I was administratively involved in the company, which stopped about 3 or 4 years ago. And at that time, it was about 30% or 40% was reference work from other laboratories.
Now, do you have an ongoing working relationship with the FBI?
Yes.
Now, I don't want to mention any specific cases, but are you currently working with Agent Roger Martz of the FBI on some criminal cases?
Well, we are really not actually working on them, but we are discussing how to work on them that we have, yeah.
And does that work involve detecting or developing methods to detect the presence of poisons in tissue?
In one case, it will involve the development of methods. In the other case, it will be what analysis will the FBI do or has done already, and what analysis will I do because of my capabilities.
And Special Agent Roger Martz is sitting right behind
Yes,
you, right?
yes, of course.
Now, could you tell us very briefly when you started doing work with chromatography?
Well, I started doing work with paper chromatography, which was the first form of chromatography that came out while I was still a graduate student. So that was in, let's say, 1950. I started doing thin layer chromatography, which is a more modern method, and used it extensively following a Gordon Research Conference in which I participated in 1959 or 60. Same year I started working with gas chromatography, 1959, 1960. I started to work with gas chromatography coupled, hyphenated, the hyphenated systems, with the technique called mass spectrometry, in the 70s.
Now, was that around the time when that technology actually was started?
Well, the technology started earlier as an academic research technology, but it's around the time where there were beginning to be some bioanalytical applications for real-life situations.
Now, have you done work in what's called HPLC, or high-pressure liquid chromatography?
Yes, I have.
Since about what time?
1973, I think 1973 is when we got our first instrument, after I'd familiarized myself with it for some time prior thereto. And so that's about when I started to actually hands-on do a lot of work on it and then supervise a lot of work.
Do you currently in your lab do mass spectrometry?
Oh yes, we do.
And how many instruments do you have that do mass spectrometry?
7 or 8.
Now, we'll get into the details of what that is in a second, but have you done what's called tandem mass spectrometry?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
A few times, or hands-on only.
Okay.
It's, again, that is a relatively new, not commonly available technique in toxicology labs, at least.
Could you tell us briefly what is EDTA?
Well, EDTA is the name of a chemical substance which in full is called ethylene, E-T-H-Y-L-E-N-E, diamine, D-I-A-M-I-N-E, acetic, A-C-E-T-I-C, acid. Ethylene, diamine, tetraacetic acid.
Put up slide number 1 in my... This would be the 1257 series. This would be 1257A. Doctor, can you see the monitor right there to your right?
Yes.
Is that is that what EDTA is, what you just
Yes.
spelled? Okay. Could you tell us what a purple or lavender top tube is?
That name is in medicine, in laboratory medicine, or anyone who uses human blood for testing, the name for an evacuated tube which has a stopper that is, some call it lavender, some call it purple in color, and that makes you recognize it clearly as a tube which has EDTA in it.
I'd like to have a photograph marked as next in order.
All right.
And I'd like to have this put on the Elmo, please.
This is a photo of tubes.
Yes.
1258, Mrs. Robertson, photo of tubes.
Doctor, could you look at your monitor and tell us if that appears to be two purple top tubes?
That is the typical appearance of the purple top tubes, yes.
Now, what is the relationship between EDTA and a purple top tube?
Well, EDTA, either as a potassium or a sodium salt, is put into the purple top tubes, which have a vacuum in them, so that when blood is drawn and mixed with it, that blood won't coagulate. That's the sole purpose. It has some preservative properties for certain types of cells and other things, but what the EDTA does, the EDTA is what's called in English a claw compound, like a lobster's claw, a chelating agent. And what the excess of EDTA does that's in the tube is combine with all of the calcium in the blood and tie it up. Without calcium, blood won't clot. If you don't do that, then the blood will clot in 5-7 minutes.
Now, you had experience in your background working with EDTA.
A great deal, yes.
And approximately when did you do your first work with EDTA?
In the early 50s.
And just briefly, what was the nature of that work?
The first thing that I became involved in is to study its properties as to whether or not it could be used for treating acute lead poisoning in small children who were at the Jefferson Hospital. And then in working with one of the physicians in administering, in designing doses, administering it, collecting blood and urine, and measuring the lead that's coming out of the child. Then this was expanded to working with it in occupational employment cases where people are exposed to lead, battery workers and others, both in treating their kind of lead poisoning, which is different from what is in children, but also we developed a diagnostic test for whether to determine whether or not someone had an excessive body burden of lead and therefore should be treated even before they got really sick. So all that was published work. And then I did a substantial amount of test tube work with EDTA and also experimental work with animals. I also did experimental work, or rather studies. It wasn't really experimental, it was clinical work in determining how EDTA mobilizes and causes the excretion of other elements besides lead. Again, with published work for copper, for zinc, for a number of other metals that EDTA can chelate. In the process, well, this was the biological work. The in vitro work was measuring the strength of the way that EDTA holds on to metals. How easily will it rip it away from some part of the body? How it will redistribute the lead, and whether it's absorbed. I fed in animals, not in man. We did not feed any people because we came to the conclusion that oral EDTA can only do harm rather than good to people who have metal poisoning.
Some of that work involve analyzing biological samples for the presence of EDTA?
Some of it did, yes.
Starting about when?
I made some attempts at analysis of EDTA as early as 1954 or 55. They were successful for a qualitative test in urine, but not for anything else. They were color tests of a sort. I did a lot of tests, not a lot, some testing for EDTA while I was toxicologist for the city, because ever so often I would receive a blood specimen and I needed to know what was the preservative and the pathologist couldn't help me. He didn't remember whether he had dumped in blood from reagents from a lavender top tube or from a gray top tube. A gray top tube has fluoride and oxalate in it, or whether he didn't put anything in. After death, blood stays fairly liquid. It clots, but then it liquefies again. So you can't really tell. If you get a tube of clotted blood, you know that's blood that has not been preserved with anything, usually. That's why it clots quickly.
Have you worked on chromatography techniques to detect the presence of EDTA?
Yeah, that came later.
And that started about when?
Oh, I started to do some of that around 1976 or 77. But it isn't for detecting EDTA at ultra-trace levels. It's to determine whether a blood specimen is an EDTA specimen, has a lot of EDTA in it, or whether it's a fluoride oxalate specimen, whether it's been preserved with that. More recently, I'm able to determine whether heparin was used. I couldn't do that until recently.
Doctor, have you, I didn't ask you about your publications before. Have you published articles and made presentations in your area of expertise?
Yes,
Approximately how many?
over 100.
And do you know approximately how many of those, how many of your articles are in peer-reviewed journals?
What?
How many of your articles appeared in peer-reviewed journals?
I think well over half.
And did some of those articles include articles about EDTA?
Yes,
And approximately how many?
dozen or so.
Now, were you asked to review results of a study performed by the FBI to determine whether there was EDTA present on bloodstains found on a pair of socks found in Mr. Simpson's bedroom and from a blood stain found on the back gate of Nicole Brown Simpson's condo?
Yes,
And have you examined test results produced by the FBI on those questions?
yes,
Have you also examined a validation study that the FBI performed in February of this year?
to the extent to which they were submitted, yes.
Incidentally, at one point were you consulted by the Los Angeles Police Department during the course of this case about methods to detect EDTA in bloodstains?
Yes,
Do you remember who that was?
Mr. Henkhaus, Henchaus.
And did you provide him with some materials to assist them in developing a method to detect EDTA?
Yes, of course.
Now, do you have an opinion as to whether the method used by the FBI to detect the presence of EDTA in bloodstains is a valid method for detecting the presence of EDTA in blood?
Yes, the method is valid. It is capable of detecting EDTA, of identifying it, of measuring it even. If not the way it's done, the measurement is, you can't really make any quantitative measurements too readily.
In terms of determining whether it's there or
Whether
not.
it is there and whether it is there in a range, a very wide range of amounts.
Now, when we talk about amounts, do we use the term parts per million?
No, that's concentration.
Concentrate, okay.
That's a different.
And tell us briefly, what is, when you use the term parts per million, what does that mean?
It means one part, in the case of EDTA, in 1 million parts of blood. This would mean, for instance, 1 microgram per milliliter, which is 1 gram, or 1 million micrograms of blood. That's 1 part per million.
Did the method developed by the FBI that you reviewed, in your opinion, is it capable of detecting amounts of EDTA in blood in the parts per million range?
Yeah, in a range of maybe 10 parts per million and higher, perhaps somewhat less than that, perhaps 5 parts per million and higher.
Now, is parts per billion 1,000th of parts per million?
Yep, it's 1 billionth, and a billion is 1,000 million.
But if you're relating parts per million to parts per billion, you're talking about 1,000th as much of something in
Right.
parts per billion.
Yes. There are 1,000 parts per million in 1 part per, there are 1,000 parts per billion in 1 part per million. They are the same. 1,000 parts per billion or 1 part per million.
Now,
That's
Doctor, I
right.
want to ask you some questions about EDTA and what characteristics the FBI was looking for. Can we have slide C? Now, do chemical compounds like EDTA have what's called a molecular weight?
Yes, sure.
And is this isn't in pounds or ounces, is it?
It's in units. The molecular weight is how many hydrogen atoms you can cram into a molecule to get the same weight. That's the unit. The weight of hydrogen is nominally 1. So something that has a molecular weight of 292, as we have here, and 292 is the molecular weight, is as big, weighs as much as 292 hydrogen atoms,
So what is the molecular weight of EDTA?
292.
And I assume different compounds have different molecular weights?
Yes, there are other compounds with 292 weight, but they are not terribly many.
Is 292 a relatively high molecular weight?
Relatively high, yes.
And
as you go higher, fewer and fewer compounds will have exactly the same weight.
Now, looking at the chart on the screen, the chart indicates adding a proton to 292 gives you what?
293. The
And
proton's the same as a hydrogen atom with a charge on it, positive charged hydrogen atom.
And why do you need to have a charge on it?
Well, you need a charge on an atom in order for the principle of mass spectrometry to measure it. The mass spectrometer measures charged atoms, measures the charges. And what it does, it gives you a number which is the ratio of the mass, the molecular weight, over the charge. In this case, it would be 293 over 1, so that the ion that you then have, which is EDTA with a positive charge hooked on its head, has a weight of 293, and the charge, that's the mass, 293, the charge is called Z, like zebra, over 1. So it's 293.
So is it fair to say that if you were looking for EDTA in a substance, one of the things you'd look for was whether you had something that weighed 293?
Yes.
And what's that called, 293?
That's called the parent ion. It's the whole molecule plus a charge on it. So it's an ion. The whole molecule doesn't have a charge on it, but it gets a charge on it, and so it's called a parent ion, because from it can come fragments.
Now, could we have the next slide, slide D? Now, Doctor, please look at your monitor, and the bottom part of that diagram indicates that the parent ion is broken into pieces. Is that correct?
Yes, that is the function of the mass spectrometer. First thing it does, it weighs the ions that are there. It weighs the molecule. The molecule, in order to be weighed, has to have a charge. So it adds a proton and then weighs it. So it gets a 293, which is the molecule plus 1. The molecule, remember, is 292. Then it breaks that molecule into pieces, but not the way that you break a bottle of beer, but the way that a jeweler cuts a diamond. It breaks it along certain planes and not others, so that the pieces that result are somewhat predictable from the structure of the compound. If you apply energy to it, it'll break up into certain kinds of pieces. Now what it does, it weighs the pieces to see what weight do they have. In this case, one of the pieces, one of the daughters, you might say, of that 292 after it was broken up, has a weight of 160. And so that you now have two identifying characteristics. There is a substantial amount among all of the ions, over 293, enough so you can weigh it, and there is enough of the breakup product 160 so you can weigh that.
I now want to talk a little bit about chromatography. Could we have slide F? Your Honor, the last slide was 1257D.
Thank you.
This is 1257F. Now, the process that was used by the FBI in this case involved a step called chromatography and then a step called mass spectrometry, correct?
Yes.
Now, chromatography, could you describe briefly, looking at the chart up there, what is the principle of chromatography?
The principle of chromatography is the separation of compounds that are mixed together by having them go for a walk. So it's characteristic, for instance, you take a group of people, a whole bunch of people, and you say, now, I want you to walk from here to a mile from here as fast as you can. You all start at the same point. Gradually, over that mile, it spreads out until the EDTA person is somewhere there, and all the others are also spread out. Good chromatography separates a mixture into all of its components, or all of the components that you're interested in at least. And then at the end of the mile, there's someone with a camera who takes a picture of the person coming through the end gate and determines how long it took from here to the mile from here. It says that is the retention time. That's how long that person was retained on the road to the goal.
Let me go to the next slide and see if we can illustrate that, which will be G. Now, in my example, I've used a red square as an EDTA compound molecule, and two other ones, one green and one yellow. The column that's indicated on the diagram, what is that?
That is actually a glass or a metal column which is filled with a material that the person can lean on, so to speak, if you make it a parallel to this, so that there are things along the mileway where you can stop and lean on if you want to for a little before you go on. What's driving the material through that column is a liquid. In this case, in the illustrating case of people moving as fast as they can, the drive is more inward, you know, if you want to win or you just want to make it to the other end. But what is moving you is your muscles through gravity.
Now, can we have the
And
next-
some people lean longer and others lean less long, and so they start spreading out. So the column is packed with the material, and it's the mixture is pushed through the column with the liquid at a steady rate. As the mixture goes through the column, it leans on and releases from the column the different compounds, different number of times, so that again, by the end of the column, they have separated from each other. In this case, the EDTA is the slowest that I had here. It's the last one out of the column. Other things before it came out before.
Now, in the diagram, I have a clock at the top and a clock at the bottom. Is that to represent the amount of time it takes the EDTA to get from the start, go through the column, and come out the other end?
Yes, that is the stopwatch, and what it measures is the retention time.
And is that one of the things that you look at to determine whether you have EDTA in a substance?
Yes, in a good system, you can repeat that. You can take another sample of the mixture and throw it on the column and push it through, and the retention time is going to be pretty much the same, close to it, within what you allow as experimental error. It won't be the same to 10 decimals in time, but it should be close enough so that you can say, well, when I see something coming up at that time, I better think of EDTA. And that, that's what EDTA does, so it could be EDTA.
Now,
It's consistent with it.
and can you also put known EDTA into the system to see how much time it takes to get through, so you have some sort of a benchmark to...
Well, you start out with known EDTA just to determine its retention time. But since from day to day and actually from run to run you can get differences, what you like to use is another substance which you also put in yourself at the same time, which also has a known retention time, but more importantly, is closely enough related to the EDTA so that if there's going to be a change in retention time for the EDTA, there'll be a similar shift for your known substance that's called an internal standard. So now instead of saying it took 2 minutes for the EDTA to come out, you say it took twice as long as it does for the control substance, for the internal standard, which took 1 minute. The next time maybe you really have a very different column, and it takes 3 minutes for the EDTA to come out. It'll take 1.5 minutes for the internal standard. So the ratio will remain the same. It's a very important part of reproducing your values as closely as you can.
Okay, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but now the technique that was used by the FBI is called liquid chromatography, correct? And does that mean that it's a liquid that they pushed through the column that might have had EDTA in it?
Yes.
Now, the next stage is the mass spectrometry stage, correct?
Well, actually, the next stage is getting it from the end of the column to the mass spectrometer.
And that, to be put through the mass spectrometry, does it have to be a liquid or a gas?
Well, it has to be either particles that are so fine that they are virtually no bigger than gas molecules or that they can move, or it has to be a gas.
And now, using liquid chromatography, if it comes out as a liquid, how do they get it to a gas or to a small misting particle?
Well, originally, way originally, what you did is you watched the liquid chromatograph and the detector, and when the peak started to come out, when one of the molecules, or of course a lot of them, because you put in not just one molecule of each, but whatever came out, you caught it in a net, in a fraction collector. Then you took that fraction and you put it into a tiny glass vial and evaporated off the liquid part of it so that you had a solid in it. Then what you did is you shoved that vial into the mass spectrometer and you heated it up until the material in the little vial on the probe evaporated, formed a gas, and then it could react in the mass spectrometer.
What technique did the FBI use?
The FBI used a method where the liquid goes into a very tiny, but moderately long piece of a glass capillary. It has a tiny, it's a glass tube with a tiny opening and a tiny run. That is heated and has applied to it a very high voltage and a moderate amperage, high electricity. That's why it's called electrospray. At the same time, a gas passes over it, a sheathing gas and a separating gas. And what happens is that the liquid at the end of the capillary is sprayed out, and in minuscule form and dry form, the water is removed by the sheathing gas, goes into the mass spectrometer. So it's one way, and it's the most recent way, and one of the most efficient ways of getting the sample in there. Before that, you turn it into a gas in a chamber, and then you put the gas out through a small opening which was partly open to the open air, so that much of the carrier gas would go out into the air, and the stream of vapor of the molecules that you wanted would go in. And that's a much less efficient way of transferring from the column to the mass spectrometer.
The electrospray process, does it change any of the ions?
No, it doesn't. If it changed the ions, then you basically wouldn't know where you stand.
Now, electrospray, is that do you use that technique in your lab?
No.
And is that a fairly expensive piece of equipment to use?
Well, Yes, of course, all equipment's expensive. All of this type equipment is expensive, but it is of relatively recent origin. It's the most up-to-date transfer of molecules in the Hewlett-Packard instrument. And as a commercial laboratory, we have to wait until something has proven itself before we put out $750,000. So we are not the first ones, but also not the last ones to get it. And in time we will.
Now, I'd like to move on to slide I and get into the mass spectrometry part of this process. Now, does the mass spectrometer have a way of looking to see whether the 293 parent ion is there?
Yes.
And how does it, just very briefly, how does it do that?
Well, basically what the mass spectrometer is a piece of equipment which, to characterize it, weighs the particles that are in there, sorts them out into groups, into 293s and others, and then weighs how many of those particles are there, what's the intensity of that ion. Then that's a regular mass spectrometer, single-stage mass spectrometer.
Now, in the kind of testing that was done here is a filtering system set up so that only the 293 parent ion gets through.
Well, then in this case, what you do is you set up a filter and you set it so that only the 293 will get through. That's done both in terms of the mass but also in terms of charge, and such a filter works quite nicely. So you isolate from the others the 293 ion. Now, what you can do is put it on a detector and say it's present, period. Or you can put it into a second mass spectrometer, but in fairly pure form. You just have 293 molecular ions there. All the other stuff that's in there is not going with it.
Okay, let me put up slide J. Now, is that an indication of just in chart form, of the parent ion getting through the filter and other ions not getting
Right.
through?
That's what a filter does. It keeps the other particles out, and the 293s go into the next place, which is either a detector, which says, yeah, there are 293, I'm seeing things, and the filter's taking everything out except the 293. So what I'm seeing is 293.
Now, can we have chart K? Now, is there a second step in order to look for the daughter ion?
Yeah. If instead of going to a detector only, it is detected, but it also is then put into another mass spectrometer by the system, then that mass spectrometer again breaks the 293 the way a jeweler breaks a piece of a diamond. He starts out with a 10 carat, he breaks it down to 3, 2, etc. Then he takes one of the 3 carats and cuts that further.
Can we have slide L, please? Now, does this chart indicate what happens when it passes through the second filter? It's broken, and then the 160 daughter ion is measured.
Right. Again, there is a filter which focuses, it's a focusing device, but which filters out other things and pushes them aside and looks for 160 masses. Those 160 masses are gathered together, and one by one they hit a detector. So the detector says, I see things, I see things, I see things, and they are 160s because the others have been filtered out.
Now, can we go to slide M, please? So if you were trying to determine whether EDTA was present in a substance, what are the 3 things that you would look for with this kind of testing?
The first thing that you look for is if I extract something with water and put it through my column that I'm using in this experiment, where I've tested EDTA and found that it comes out in 5, 6 minutes or whatever, will something come out at 6 minutes? That's the retention time, or whatever the retention time is. Then, what I will do is to have a mass spectrometer look at what comes out at that retention time and tell me whether I'll focus on the 293, whether there's anything 293, which is also a characteristic of EDTA. So the retention time is one characteristic. The 293 that I'm looking at, that means I'm only looking for orange-eyed people, you might say. If I see orange-eyed people, I count them. Others I don't count. I take all the orange-eyed people after I've counted them and throw them in the next mass spectrometer, and it breaks them up and only leaves the orange eyes, which weigh 160, let's say.
So we're looking for those three things.
Retention time, well, no, we look for more than that. We look for water solubility, because that's how we got it. We look for it going through the column at all, because a lot of things don't go through that column. And also that if it does go through the column, that it takes it as much time and no more and no less than the window that I know will contain EDTA. So that's really, in a sense, the third parameter. Then comes the, does it contain enough molecular ions, 293 masses, you know, are there enough guys in there with, or gals with 293 on their shirts so that I can actually count them? Because if it's less than a certain number, I can't really count them. So can I see them? Are they there in my detection, within my detection limit? Then, after breaking those up, the third parameter is the pieces that have 160 tattooed on them. And that's what we're looking for. So that we have essentially 5 parameters.
Did you want to take a break?
5 minutes.
Okay. Now, also, one of the other things that is measured in this system is what's called ion count.
Yes.
And that's, is that essentially counting the number of ions that are getting through to the 160 stage there?
Well, it's counting the number of ions that the detector can see, and where it can separate the counts one from the other, where it can really count 1, 2, 3, 4. And that means that the detector has to snap at an ion and record it before the next ion gets there. Otherwise, it'll record 2 as 1. So it depends on how quickly it is scanning what's coming in. And if it scans 1,000 times a second, it's not going to miss many particles, many 293s. But if it scans it 50 times a second, then it'll count 10 as 1, you know, like a bunch. So, but that's what it does. It gives you a measure of the amount of that particular 293 or 160 that has come into the mass spectrometer, has been ionized, and then in the first one seen and counted as 293 ions. And then in the second one, how many counts did the detector make?
Now, can we go to the next slide, please? Slide N. In the testing done by the FBI, did you review material indicating that they had tested a swatch from the back gate representing stain number 117?
Yes.
And what number did the FBI assign to that stain, that swatch?
I would have to see the numbering system. I think I have it here. May I?
Sure.
Refresh my memory. Okay, from the back gate. They gave that the number Q204, I believe.
Now, the sock stain, is your understanding that the sock stain that was examined was a cutting from the edge of a large stain on the sock?
Yes.
And what number was that given? Was that given number Q206?
Yes, Q206.
Now, could we switch to slide P, please? Well, is your understanding that, well, there we go. On slide P, what's your understanding from the paperwork prepared by the FBI as to where Q206 came from on the sock?
Q206 was cut from the edge of a stain.
Could you look at the monitor? Does that appear to be a chart showing the approximate location of that cutting?
It's similar to what I had on a piece of paper, yes. It's a good representation.
And the green area is represented, that's a large cutout on the sock, correct?
Yes,
That was presumably already there. And Q206 was a cutting taken from the edge
yes.
of that larger cutting. Was there also a swatch submitted that had been taken from the large swatch that had been cut that was called Q207?
You mean that was taken from the swatch that didn't have the stain on it?
No, that was taken presumably from the large cutout piece and sent to the FBI along with the sock. Or are you aware of that?
The 207?
Yes.
I don't think so. I don't see it in my papers here, the Q207. It may be. I would have to look through the pile. It's a big pile and it wasn't submitted in a good order, so I'd have to look through the whole thing. But I don't recall it.
Let me ask you this. Did you see any testing done using the method that we've described, looking for the 293 parent ion, the 160 daughter ion, on any sock stain other than Q206?
No.
Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our mid-morning recess at this time. Please remember all my admonitions to you. We'll stand in recess for about 15 minutes. Dr. Rieders, you can step down, come back in 15 minutes, please.
Thank you.
All right. All right, the record to reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel, that Dr. Fredric Rieders is on the witness stand undergoing direct examination by Mr. Blasier. And Mr. Blasier, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rieders, what is a chromatogram?
A chromatogram is a depiction of what at various times is seen by a detector looking at the end of the column where the in this case, the liquid comes out, and where the liquid itself does not elicit a signal from the detector, but anything that comes out that is not the moving liquid, that is not the airstream, that is one of the people, anything that's one of the people walking down the road a mile comes out, the detector shows its presence and some measure of how much of it, how many molecules, or how large an amount, not concentration, but how large an amount is passing in front of the detector. And depicts that by a peak along a line, and every time something comes out, there's another peak, if it is seen by the detector.
Can I have marked as a group exhibit 2 diagrams, 2 chromatograms?
1259.
1259 A and B. For the record, 1259A is has DA discovery number 4088 and is a chromatogram on sample Q206. 1259B is DA discovery number 4094 and is also a chromatogram of Q206.
Right, Q206, thank you.
Doctor, let me show you 1259A and B. Can you tell me if those are chromatograms?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to, we've scanned those as well. Could we have 4088?
Sir?
We're going to show you something on the monitor, Doctor. Doctor, could you look at the monitor and compare what's up there with 4088 that you have in your hand, and other than one being a positive and one being a negative, do they appear to be the same?
Looks like it is that what's on the monitor is from that same chromatogram.
Now, that is a chromatogram produced by the FBI on the sock stain, correct? The Q206?
That is correct.
Now, I want to ask you about just a couple of things on this form. I'm going to zoom in a little bit up in this corner. Try to here, anyway. What does the 160 up in that corner there where the arrow is indicate?
$160, where is that, in the upper right corner?
The upper left.
Upper left, I'm sorry. I see on the chromatogram itself. It means that what is being monitored by the detecting device is the daughter ion 160 that has been isolated in the second mass spectrometer and filtered, and now filtered and isolated from the other ions, and is now impacting on the detector as the liquid is flowing out of the column, being transformed into the electrospray, entering the first mass spectrometer, and going into the next one where it's converted into a daughter ion. So that means that is the ion that's being monitored.
Now, what does that tell you about whether the parent ion, what does that tell you about the 293 parent ion?
Well, that in and of itself only tells me that one of the daughter ions of whatever it was that went into the second mass spectrometer, and which was the 293 daughter ion, broke up and gave off one piece that's a 160.
So we know that this had to have come from the 293 parent ion.
Yes.
Now let me blow up a little bit where this peak in the chart is. Can you tell me what the number 37 means?
The number 37 is you see a line on the bottom? What it does, it counts the number of the scans that go on. This is scan number 37, that the detector scans the gas that's coming past. And on the 37th pass, it has this particular peak. So that's the retention time of the substance in terms of number of scans rather than minutes. But it's the same thing. It's along a movement axis. The liquid flows past, and the earliest things are on the right, and the current, the latest things are on the left.
Now the other two numbers right below the 37, what do those mean?
The first of these is the detector took in the signals that it got, and it added them all up, and it measured how high a peak was generated from it in counting units. And the height of that peak was 24,223 counting units. The next line, what it does, it makes measurements of all the points in that peak that it can and gives you an area of that peak. Because as you can see, that peak has a height and it has an area. You can see it right on there. And the area is 98,443 counts. In short, the area in counts is roughly four times as many counts to cover the area than to cover the height.
Now, does the size of the peak? Let me withdraw that. How does the machine know where to draw a triangle? Does that depend on what the operator tells it to do?
Well, it can be that the operator says, I want you to count everything that's between a certain space, or it can be termed to select that pick 2 points that are on a line of where this substance is coming through, because, walking past the detector, you don't move past it instantly, nor do all the molecules, but first a few appear, then more and more and more, and then less and less and less, so you get this kind of a peak. It's the appearance, the presence, and the disappearance that is shown. So you can program how wide a base you want, or you can program, draw a line from a point of a certain height. You see on the left the counts are 50, 100, up to where the M over Z 160s. There are these count numbers. And so these are height numbers really in a sense. So it says draw anything that has a height less than what some of the noise might be to the next point where you have that same. So you can do it in a variety of ways, but the instrument is instructed over what range to draw the line and the peak.
Now let me blow up the top part of the chart where it says masses 158 to 150 or 162. What does that tell you?
That means that the eye of the mass spectrometer, the way that it is counting is that it'll count anything that comes past it that has a 158 or a 159 or a 160 or a 161 or a 162 M over Z. If it's a high resolution instrument, then it would start counting 158.1, 158.2, etc. But ordinarily it just counts these unit masses, so that anything in that range is seen by it. And This way you can actually get peaks in various places. In some places, in some retention times, there may be some things that have a moderate amount of more of 159, in others 160, but that is all within the mass range in which the daughter ion sits right in the middle.
Now, if you set the machinery to just look at the 160 rather than a range from 158 to 162, are you likely to have a higher peak?
Yeah, because it can, I told you, it depends, the number that it gets will depend on how rapidly it's checking off. You know, I see one, I see one, I see one. If it's slow, then it's got 2 or 3 that it sees at the same time, and you get a lower number of counts. If you focus just on the 160, then that same counts per minute is counting just 60s. Right now, it's counting anything between 158 and 162, and so if they're stuck together, it just becomes one count rather than separate counts.
Is it the same kind of thing that you might have if I was taking a picture of you with a video camera? If I was scanning it from the judge over to the bailiff, back and forth like this, you're going to be on the screen less time than if I just put it right on you.
Right. And so if you needed to sum all those pictures that were taken of me, you'd have fewer pictures if it's scanned than if it just sat right on me during that time.
And if you do an even broader scan, the peak would be equivalently less, is that correct?
Less and less, yes.
And you might not even see it at some point.
Yes.
This will be 1257Q. Now, Doctor, could you take a look and tell me if the 2 charts that are on the screen now are the same as the 2 that I handed to you, 4088 and 4094?
Yes, they are what appears to be an accurate reproduction of what I have in front of me.
And are those 2 different tests that the FBI ran on Q206, the sock stain?
They are 2 separate tests, it looks like, on the stain.
Can we go to R? Now, Doctor, I've highlighted the peaks on those 2 charts. Does the chart up on the screen there correlate to the peaks that appear on those 2 chromatograms?
Yes.
Now, is the retention time on those 2 charts consistent with the retention time that the FBI determined you would have with EDTA?
Yes.
And do both of those charts demonstrate not only the presence of the 293 parent ion, but the 160 daughter ion?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether, based on those chromatograms from the FBI, whether the presence of EDTA has been demonstrated on the blood stain from the sock, Q206?
Just on the basis of the 160 or the entire picture?
The entire picture.
On the basis of the entire picture, this has been, at these concentrations, presented as strongly as it can with present technology.
As what?
As EDTA.
Now, EDTA is what's called an organic compound, correct?
Yes, it has carbon in it, therefore it's organic.
And anything that has carbon in it is called an organic compound?
Yes.
And do we know how many there are in the universe? Organic compounds.
Well, No, we don't know how many organic compounds there are in the universe. Obviously not, because we are discovering new ones, we are making new ones, but we're also discovering new ones every day.
Is it possible that there might be some other substance in the universe that gave the same pattern as we see here as EDTA?
Well, of course, you know, there might be anything in the universe. We don't know all the things that are in the universe, so of course there could be.
Do you know of any specific compound other than EDTA that has the 293 parent ion, the 160 daughter ion, the appropriate retention time, and the other characteristics that you described about solubility other than EDTA?
Well, as far as retention time is concerned, I have not seen any chromatography. This is the first time that it was done under these conditions, so I can't relate it. There's no internal standard, so I can't assign a relative amount to it. But as far as the parent ion, the estimated retention time, that means under the conditions that they use, a short retention substance, relatively short retention substance, a parent ion of 293 and a daughter ion of 160, I don't know of any such substance, and I have not been able to find any in the search of the Merck index of substances. So I've looked and I haven't found any.
I have another document marked, actually, let's make it C of that last series because it goes together. Should be 1259C.
All right.
Doctor, take a look at this first, then we'll put it on the Elmo. Does this appear to be what's called a full daughter ion scan chromatogram for Q206?
Yes, it scans all the masses from 130, which I think is one of the lowest daughter ions of the 293 ion, all the way up to 295, which is the molecular ion plus 3.
Now, can I take it that what this is, it's looking for the other pieces in addition to the 160?
That is correct.
Can you put this on the Elmo, please? Doctor, could you look up at the top right-hand corner and tell us what range was being scanned with that chromatogram?
From mass 130, which is one of the breakup pieces of the parent ion. When that breaks up, it gives rise to 130, among others, all the way up to 295, which, as I said, is a piece larger than the molecule.
Now, is using my analogy of a television camera, are we talking about a very long range of scan?
Yes.
So is it fair to say that any particular point that's being looked at is not being looked at very frequently because of the broad range of the scan?
Yes.
Now, in this particular one, there are no peaks or triangles identified, correct?
Well, they are not identified by being drawn as triangles or numbered. That's correct.
Do you see any things on there that could be potential indications of the presence of these ions at around the right retention time?
Oral. Oral.
Yes, indeed. We have within the same range within which we determined before a countable picture, because it was more focused. Remember in the previous one, we do have the highest peaks in that chromatogram fall into the same retention time range for all of the ions as they did for the ones that were clearly recognized as being 160 ions because of the focus on them.
Now, I'm pointing my pen to the top one, which is the 132 daughter ion. Is this what you're talking about? Is the peak right in here? Right there.
Yes, except that the way that this, in the electrospray, you get movement, you don't get that clear a definition, that there are several points in here which you would find with the 160 daughter ions.
And now the 160 chart right below that, is that what you're talking about there, that peak that
Right.
is a possible indication of the
Yes.
presence of that? Now, you will acknowledge, will you not, that these peaks aren't nearly as well defined as the ones we've looked at before, correct?
Yes, of course, they are much smaller. The area is smaller and the peak is smaller because all of the energy for counting is spread over the range of 130 to
295?
to 295, whereas in the other one, it is concentrated. All the energy of counting is to individually count each 160 fragment along with the other ones close next to it.
Does this mean that the EDTA that you saw in the earlier two charts has somehow disappeared?
No, it's you have a less sensitive method. So the same amount of EDTA will show up as a peak that is not as tall and that doesn't have as much of an area. It looks fuzzier. It's looking at it through a somewhat darker glass than you looked at the 160. But you get more information in return.
I have two other charts. Could we have these marked as next in order A and B?
Is this 1260? 1260,
1260 A and B?
yes.
And for the record, 1260A has DA discovery number 4084 and is a chromatogram from a testing from Q204, the stain from the back gate. And 1260B is DA discovery number 4049, is a second test on the same stain from a different day. Dr. Rieders, let me show you 1260A and 1260B. Does this appear to be two chromatograms from two different tests on two different days of the stain from the back gate in Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium?
Well, I can't see the dates. They are at different times, but the date is not apparent.
Now,
Is that what you have on the side? 222 and 228, is that the date?
yes.
Yes.
Incidentally, when you were provided with the materials from the FBI the first time, were you able to tell what dates the tests were done on?
On these papers?
Yes.
No.
And why was that?
They weren't shown. They were cut off or they weren't shown.
Were they in the order in which the tests had been run?
No.
Were they somewhat mixed up?
Yes.
Could we have 17Q? I'm sorry, 1257Q. Let me show you what's 1257S. Does this appear to be an accurate depiction of both the chromatograms 4049, 4084, two tests on the back gate stain on 2 different days?
Yes.
Next slide, please. Doctor, do the peaks shown on those 2 chromatograms have a retention time consistent with the presence of EDTA?
Yes, they do. They have the same retention time range. They have a retention time well within the range shown by EDTA.
And do they also demonstrate the presence of both the 293 parent ion and the 160 daughter ion?
Yes, because without the 293, you can't get the 160 in the MS mode.
Do you have an opinion on whether, based on those chromatograms, there is EDTA present in the stain from the back gate?
In my opinion, yes, it demonstrates that there is EDTA present in that stain.
Now, what are negative controls?
Negative controls are samples put through the same procedure as your sample at issue, and samples which are known not to contain any added substance that you're looking for. And if run at appropriate sensitivity, they are negative controls because by the method used, they will give a negative test results if A, there is in fact no more, or if there isn't any there, and B, that the method that has been applied has worked as well there.
Did Agent Martz of the FBI test an area of the sock that did not have any apparent blood on it?
Yes,
Is
that's
that-
what he states he did.
Is that what's meant by negative control?
I believe so, that's what he meant, yes.
And did that indicate the presence of EDTA?
No, it did not.
And what does that tell you about the blood stain?
Well, that means, since it is my opinion that the blood stain contained EDTA, that came from the blood and not from the sock.
Does that rule out any contribution from laundry detergent or something else that might be throughout the entire sock?
Reasonably certainly, yes, unless, of course, the blood was dotted with laundry detergent, you know, and nothing else on the sock was.
Now, as to the back gate, did Agent Martz run any negative controls on the back gate?
Yes,
And were those from a swatch taken from an area just away from the blood, but no blood on it?
yes.
And how many of those negative controls did he run?
I recall 4.
And what was the results of his testing on those 4?
3 were negative and 1 was positive.
When you get a mixture like that, what's the interpretation?
Well, the interpretation is that you better run 4 more or do something like that because you have something there which doesn't make sense.
But the fact that you have 3 negative controls coming back negative, what does that indicate?
Well, you know, if you want to put it on a majority basis, that there's a 75% probability that it's truly negative and that the 4th one is something that happened, either contamination, or an accident, or, you know, something happened to that sample, or that got mixed up. I can't tell you what, obviously, but
Does the fact that 3 of the negative controls are negative indicate that there was no EDTA on the control swatch taken from the gate but not from the blood?
oh yes, it does.
Now, were you asked to consider the question of whether the FBI's methods were capable of reliably determining the amount of EDTA that the test detected to any degree of analytical certainty or accuracy?
The amount no, I really don't think that it is capable of doing reasonably acceptable quantitative analysis job at all, which is inherent not in what the FBI did, but in the electrospray method.
Were you asked to determine whether the FBI methods were capable of reliably determining concentrations of EDTA in the evidence samples?
No way. And not only because of what I said before, but in order to do concentrations, you'd really have to know how much sample was in that swatch that you analyzed, how much got wiped off there, how much blood was in there that you have. And there's no way that you can really tell that from the tests that were done.
Now, again, by concentrations, we're talking about parts per million
Or parts per billion or whatever, yeah.
Was the FBI's testing methodology capable of determining parts per billion, in your opinion?
Well, no, it was not. Not at all.
Now, with the technique that the FBI used, we had talked previously about ion count, in other words, how high the peak is. You recall that?
Yes.
With this testing methodology, when they don't use an internal